Masechet Zevaḥim Daf Kof He. We are discussing the law of Parim Anisrafim and Se'irim Anisrafim. These are bulls and goats like the ones that are brought on Yom Kippur, where the blood is sprinkled inside the Hechal, and then part of the animal is burnt on the Mizbeach, but the vast majority of the meat, the skin, the rest of the carcass is supposed to be taken outside of the walls of the Yerushalayim, all the way outside of the city, and burnt out there. That's why it's called Parim Hanisrafim, that they are entirely burnt, unlike other korbanot, that most of it, all of it, is either on the Mizbech, like a Korban Olah, or most of it is eaten by Kohanim, like a Chatat and Asham, or by the owners for Kadashim Kalim. In this case, Parim Hanisrafim, almost all of the carcass of the animal is supposed to be burnt outside of Jerusalem. Now, the proper procedure is that first you sprinkle the blood inside, and only then you take the carcass out of the walls. There is a halacha. We saw the pasuk that says that the kohanim that are involved in the burning, they all become tameh. Their clothes become tameh, they become tameh. We'll get to that halacha in a minute. But right now we're focusing on a different halacha, which is that the order matters. If the kohanim take the body of the animal outside of the courtyard. So in this picture that I made with the help of AI, we have Kohanim carrying the a sa'ir, a goat that has to be burnt outside. Inside here, where they are now, is the temple courtyard. Outside is the Temple Mount, outside of the courtyard. And so they're carrying it out. Imagine they're a few steps forward so that they're half in and half out, and this red line is the half of the animal. Now, if they take the entire animal out of the courtyard before its blood is sprinkled on the Mizbeach, then it becomes invalid. If it's invalid, then they cannot burn it as is proper outside of Jerusalem. Rather, there would be a fire out here on the Temple Mount, and they would burn it there. They can't bring it back into the courtyard because it's invalid. They can't take it outside of Jerusalem because it's invalid. That's only for a valid korban is outside of Jerusalem. Instead, it's burnt on the Temple Mount on that third fire that would be out here. Okay, that's if it goes out before the blood is sprinkled. If you do it proper procedure, you sprinkle the blood first and then take it out, then everything's good. Then they'll keep walking all the way outside of Jerusalem and burn it there. Well, our opening question is, what if it's half in and half out? So this gets to the next complication here. Ba'er bi el azar. Parim anisrafim usirim anisrafim she'asaru bo b'mi'ut eber mahu. So already we're assuming that if it's a majority outside, then we follow the majority. And it would become, if it's a majority is outside already, and the blood was not sprinkled yet, that's it becomes invalid. If a majority of the body of the animal is inside, then it's still okay. You still have a chance to walk back or just sprinkle it at that point, and then you'll be fine. Now, here's our case. We have a case where the animal itself, imagine, is 51% outside, 49% inside. However, the complication is regarding a limb. Okay, forget the front limbs. Imagine the front limbs are all sticking out. We have a problem with the back limb here. The back limb, you see, is mostly in the back leg, but it's sticking out. The front of the back leg is sticking past the line and sticking out in front. Now, if we ignore what's part of a limb and what's not part of a limb, just look at the entire mass of the entire animal, then the entire animal, including the front of that back leg, would amount to 51%. And 49% is in the back, including the back part of that limb. And so that would mean 51% is outside, and therefore it's invalid. However, our question is, maybe when we're looking at majorities, maybe we shouldn't look at the majority of the entire animal, but look at the majority limb by limb. And in that case, well, if we just look at this limb by itself first, then we see the majority of the limb is inside. And so it's going to pull that little bit that's sticking out, it's going to pull it back in because the majority is in. And if we calculate that way, according to limbs, well, in that case, the majority is inside, right? That limb is like, let's say it's a 1% or 2% difference, and so that will be considered in, and therefore the whole thing is considered in. this is a similar question to the popular vote in American elections versus Electoral college. If you look at the entire country in a popular vote, so let's say the popular vote is going to swing to one party. But if you look at each state by itself, or Florida itself swung the other way. And therefore, we take each state and we say, oh, this one is mostly here, so we count the whole thing as if it's there, and it'll pull that rest of it would be on the other side back towards the back. So that's the question. How do we count this? So let's see. This small amount of the limb that is sticking out, do we count it according to the majority of that limb? And that back leg has not exited the gate. Or do we look at the entire mass of the animal, not limb by limb, and it has left, and therefore the majority has left and it becomes invalid? That's the first question. We answer and we say, Pishita. No, in this case, actually that would not be a question. It would be obvious that we are not going to ignore the majority of the animal itself and follow the majority of just one limb. We want to know the whole animal, and therefore, in this case, since we include the part that's sticking out towards the front as part of the front, and therefore it's out. We're imagining that this whole animal, they move them forward a few steps, and they're exactly half in and half out, and so this part of the leg is considered out, and therefore it's considered out and invalid. So that's not Rabbi Elazar's question. Rather, a slightly different version. Ela she'asa chetzyo berov ever. What if the half of it did emerge? And so in this case, let's assume that the line is exactly 50-50 in terms of the mass of the entire animal, half outside and half inside. And this time, let's imagine that this back leg is all the way back, forget that one, and look at this front leg, which is mostly in front, but a little bit in back. And so now our question is, since this is 50-50, so then we need a tiebreaker. As a tiebreaker, can we take this front leg here and say, you know what, let's follow the majority of the limb. And therefore, the majority of the limb is in front, and that will pull that little bit that's in the back towards the front, and it'll be considered majority outside. Or not. Maybe even in this case, we consider the limb as separate, and we consider the back of this front leg to be part of the back. So we ask, Hai mi'uta de eber, this minority of the limb, batarov eber shadinan le, should we follow the majority of the rest of the limb? And then that will tilt the balance towards the front, veha nefak le, because it did emerge, or dilma batar behema shadinan le, or should we follow the entire animal? And so this question is more difficult than the first one, because in the first one, it was 51% outside, 49% inside. And so now we're not going to, in the first case of the back leg, is 51% outside. So we're not going to allow the majority of the limb to change the balance and move the 51% backwards. Rather, we're going to stick with the weight of the majority, and the weight of the majority is in the front, and so we're going to ignore the limb. But in the second case, it's exactly 50-50 if we just leave it as is. So now what are we going to do? Oh, if it's exactly 50-50, then you can apply the majority of the limb rule and say, well, this limb here is majority in front, and that can tip the balance by bringing the back leg into the front. Teko, and we leave this question in the balance, you might say. Now, there's another version of a dilemma by Rabba bar Rav Huna, and he's asking, maybe we should look at the majority of the people that are carrying it. B'mitaskin bo chamisha bnei adam unfaku telata upashu lehu tere mai batar rov mitasikin azlinan or batar behema azlinan teko. Let's say there are not 4 but 5 Kohanim that are carrying it out. 3 of them are in the front, 2 are in the back. So do you follow the majority of people, or do you follow the majority of the animal? And this 2 is left standing. In other words, imagine this guy comes and helps out, and he joins the front guys. So when we're looking at the majority, we actually have now 3 levels of majority. We can look at the majority of the limb, it's each limb, and then add that all together. Or we say, no, we ignore the limbs, we're looking at the animal as a whole, and so look at that majority. Or you can argue, we're looking at this entire structure, this entire organization. And so you look at the Kohanim. They're the ones that are doing the work. And so if it's 3 Kohanim in front, and they are outside, it doesn't matter whether the animal is half in or half out or all in. It matters what the Kohanim are. And if it's an odd number of Kohanim, then it tilts the majority outside, and then the whole structure is considered outside and invalid. But we leave this question also standing. Ba'er bi el azar. Parim us'irim anisrafim shias'u vehazru mahu. Now, what if you have a bull and goat like this that's supposed to be taken out? And now, let's shift the question to the question of Tum'ah. There's a lot of discussion among the Rishonim about each of these questions. There are multiple interpretations of if it's even talking about the halacha of the animal becoming pasul because the blood wasn't sprinkled yet, or if even the previous questions were about Tum'ah. Okay, but at this point it seems that we're shifting the question to when do the Kohanim become Tameh? If you remember, there was a machloket, and one opinion said that the Kohanim are only Tameh when they're actually burning it at the site. But the other opinion said, no, anyone who is involved even in the preparations, that from the moment that you carry it outside of the courtyard, already you're considered a part of the process of burning it. And so therefore, as soon as you go out of the courtyard, these Kohanim are Tameh in addition to the ones that are actually going to be burning the animal. So now the question is, who becomes Tameh? Okay, if they, let's say that according to this opinion that they become Tameh as soon as they go out of the courtyard, so we saw the Mishnah said the 2 in front ones will become Tameh while the 2 back ones are still Tahor, if they're half in and half out. Okay, now what if they emerge? They leave the courtyard, so we presume they're tameh. But what if they now come back in? They go around and they realize, oh, a mistake was too early or whatever, and they come back in. So now you can argue, well, once they came out, that's it, they're tameh. Or you can argue, no, they went out, but they just went for a walk for no reason. Since they came back in, so that nullifies the fact that they were starting the burning process. They're not starting the burning process because they just went out for a walk and they came back in, so they didn't do anything. So maybe those Kohanim are not going to be tameh, and only the next set that takes them out and actually reaches the place of the fire and burns them, maybe only they will be tameh. So that's why he's asking. Do we say, once you left the courtyard, that's it, you become tameh, and it doesn't matter what you do after that. It has nothing to do with it, just a law, you left. Or do we say, well, you returned, so therefore we see that you were not actually part of the process of burning, you didn't make it any closer to the process of burning, so you know what, now we see that actually you are not tameh. That's the question. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Memal, Ta Shema, Hayu Soblin Otan Bemotot, Harishonim Yasu Chus Lechomat Azara, V'achronim Lo Yasu, Harishonim Sheyatsu Chus Lechomat Azara Metamein Begadim, V'acharonim En Metamein Begadim Ad Sheyesu. So Rabbi Abba bar Memal says, we can learn it from our Mishnah, that says that if the Kohanim were carrying the bull or the goat on a pole, and the first 2, however many there are, went out of the courtyard, and the back 2 are still inside the courtyard. In that case, the front 2 people who left their clothing is tameh, and the back 2 who are still in, they are still going to be tahor until they leave. Now, if you think that once the Kohanim go out, they are permanently tameh, even if they later come back in, well, that means that the fact that the animal went outside for one moment, that's it. The Kohanim are tameh. It doesn't matter whether they're actually now inside or not. The point is that the animal went out. In that case, in the case where of the Mishnah, where there's 2 in front and 2 in back, the 2 in back also should become tameh. tameh, even though they're still inside, because the point is that the animal went out. The animal is outside. It doesn't matter where the Kohanim are. The fact that the animal went out, that makes all the Kohanim tameh. In other words, it goes together. Whether the Kohanim never left or whether they come back in, the point is that if you say that when they come back in, now they become tameh, they remain tameh, well then the ones that never left also should become tameh. If it matters only that the animal went out, and once it goes out, then all the Kohanim are permanently tameh, even if they go back in, then it should also be that the Kohanim, even though they didn't leave yet, but the animal went out, and therefore all the Kohanim should be tameh. However, the Mishnah says not so. Since the Mishnah says that the Kohanim that remain inside are tahor, that should also mean that Kohanim who went out, brought the animal out, but then came back in, they should have the same law as the Kohanim who never left, and should become tahor. Amar Ravina, Vetizbera, ha ba'ina ve'achar yabola machane veleka. Ravina says, no, there's a technicality. The problem with the Kohanim who never left is that they don't fulfill the pasuk. The pasuk says, "He who burns them shall wash the garment and bathe his flesh in water, and afterwards he can come into the camp." Now, if they never left the camp, then they can't fulfill that later they can come into the camp. So there's a technicality that if they're still in the camp, they can't become tameh because they then can't fulfill washing themselves and coming back because they're already inside. That's why the people that are inside remain tahor. Even though technically, yeah, you're right. If they leave and come back, they will remain tameh. But then we ask about that. Ela Rabbi Elazar, hechi ba'ila. But then what's Rabbi Elazar's question? Because if you need to fulfill coming back in, well, that would apply also to the Kohanim that went out, but then they came back in. Well, now that they're inside, you can't say that they're tameh because they're in, and they can't fulfill coming back in if they're already inside. So then what would be the question? It would be obvious that if they went out and came back in, they're tahor because they're inside and they can't come back in. So what case would there be a question? And the answer is, kegon de nikite la bebakul se. For example, where the Kohanim bring the sacrifice back in with long poles, but the Kohanim remain outside. So here's the case. You have Kohanim, they have this animal. Let's use the picture. And they take it outside. Okay, now it's totally outside. But then, if they went all the way to outside of Jerusalem, certainly they'd become tameh. But here's the thing. They remain outside, but they take the animal and put it at the edge of a pole so that the Kohanim are all outside, but they are able to place the goat at the edge of the pole, so the goat is back inside. So now here's our question. The Kohanim are outside, so potentially you could say that they remain tameh, and they're outside, so they can fulfill, go and wash, and then come back in. And so maybe you'll say, once they went out, they remain tameh, and so they have to wash themselves. Or do we say, no, the whole point was that they were preparing the goat for burning, but now that the goat came back in, the goat's back in, so they didn't go any step closer to burning the goat, and therefore that their reverse steps, they're putting the goat back in, actually undoes their action, and they remain tahor. So we leave this open as a question. Tenor Rabbanan, parim upara v'sa'ir המשתלח, המשלח השורפן והמוציאן מטמא בגדים. והן עצמן אין מטמאין בגדים, אבל מטמאין אוכלין ומשכין דברי רבי מאיר. We have a braita that is going to elaborate and expand on our law. Our law says that parim hanisrafin, anyone who is involved in burning it, will become tameh. And now we learn that that's true for parim, that's ours, parim hanisrafim, and also for the para, that's para aduma. The people involved there also become tameh, the kohanim, and also the seder meshtaleach, the person who takes the scapegoat on Yom Kippur out to the desert, he also becomes tameh. So in these cases, hamshaleach, the person who sends them, the person who burns them, and the person who brings them out of the temple courtyard, in all these cases, it makes their clothing tameh. also them. It makes them themselves also tameh. Now, hen atzman en metamein begadim. These things, items themselves, do not cause tumah to clothing. However, these animals will cause tumah to foods and drinks, according to Rabbi Meir. Okay, a little explanation. When these things make someone tameh, let's take our padim nisrafim. So it doesn't make everybody tameh, only the people that are involved in bringing it out and burning it. When it does make them tameh, the pod acts as an av hatum'ah, which will make the people a rishon la tum'ah. Okay, now that the chidush here of Rabbi Meir is that even though it only causes tumah to limited amounts of people, only the kohanim that are involved, nevertheless, even for other things, it does still act not as an ava tumah, but rather as a rishon tumah. So therefore, as a rishon tumah cannot make clothing tameh, so therefore the clothing does not become tameh. However, food and drink, which can become tameh from a rishon, do become tameh. And according to Rabbi Meir, this will apply also to the paraduma and to the sa'ir hamishtalech. So even though these items did not come into contact with tumah, they're just there. They're part of the process of making them into what they're doing their ritual. Nevertheless, even though they are not they're not terefa or anything, or nevela, nevertheless, they cause tum'ah and these levels. Hachamim omrim, para uparim metamein ochalim umashkin. Sa'ir mishtalach eno metameh, shu chai, v'chai eno metameh ochalin umashkin. Hachamim disagree on one of these three. They agree that regarding the para and parim, that's para aduma and parim panisrafim, those will cause tum'ah to food and drink. And of course, they cause tum'ah to anyone who's involved in taking them out and burning them. However, the Seder Mishtaleach will not cause tum'ah to food and drink, because it's a live animal, and a live animal does not make food and drink tameh. Of course, everyone agrees, that's in the Torah, the basic pasuk is that the person who is involved, the kohen who's involved in the Seder Mishtaleach, will become tameh. Yes, but that's only the person. However, because it's a live animal, and a live animal does not make is not itself tameh, does not make food and drink tameh. That's the opinion of Chachamim. Bishlama Rabbi Meir kedetana deber b'Ishmael, detana deber b'Ishmael al kol zera zerua mazreim she'en sofan tameh tuma chamura usrichin hechsher af kol she'en sofan tameh tuma chamura Sirichin hechsher. Yasta nivlat of tahor shesofa li tameh tuma chamura ve'en siricha hechsher. Now we can explain the opinion of Rabbi Meir in accordance with the Baraita from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, which teaches regarding the pasuk of making something hechsher letum'ah, making something susceptible to tum'ah by making it wet. The pasuk says that if a sheretz falls on some seeds, they are pure because it hasn't gotten wet. But if water goes on that those seeds, or apply to any other food as well, then it touches the sheretz, then it becomes tameh. The point is, like if you have fruit or vegetables or whatever, after they are cut from the tree or from the ground, if something tameh touches them, they still will not become tameh until they get wet, and in such a way that the owner wants them to get wet. Then even if they dry after that, they are now susceptible to tum'ah. Now we learn from this, just like regarding seeds, which will never end up causing a high level of tum'ah. Seeds, food, can never be an av hatum'ah. Av hatum'ah has to be something that is the source of an av hatum'ah, like a sheretz. But the food can never be this serious level of tum'ah, and it needs hechsher. It needs to be prepared means to get wet in order to even receive tum'ah. So too, we will generalize from this that any item that it was not is never going to be have a high level of tum'ah, is never going to be an ava tum'ah, also requires hechsher, and this will exclude nivlat of tahor, a nevela of a kosher bird that doesn't get proper shechita, that causes tum'ah for someone who swallows it while it's in a person's throat, then it causes tum'ah as an av hatum'ah. And therefore, since it doesn't always, if it's not in someone's throat, it's not going to cause it's not going to be an av hatum'ah. But because in certain circumstances it does cause av hatum'ah, it acts like an av hatum'ah, so therefore it does not need hechsher, even when it's not in someone's throat and it touches food and drink. It will cause that food and drink to become tameh, and it does not require hechsher. The point is that just like, according to this baraita of Rabbi Ishmael, and of nibelav of tahor, although it causes it acts like an avatumah only in limited circumstances inside a person's throat. Nevertheless, because it has that ability potentially, therefore, even if it's not in that situation, it will still cause tum'ah as a dishon, and therefore it will make food and drink tameh. So we can apply that also to Rabbi Meir's law, that all of these items, the Sa'ira Mishtalech and the Para and the Parim, all of them potentially can act like an Av HaTum'ah regarding certain people. And therefore, they don't require Hechsher, they will make food and drink tameh. So this principle makes sense. Rabbi Meir makes sense according to the principle of Rabbi Ishmael. Ela l'Rabbanan, i'it lehu detana debe Rabbi Ishmael, afilu sa'ir hamishtalech, i'let le, afilu para uparim min elan. So Rabbanan, if they agree with this baraita of Rabbi Ishmael, then they should say that sa'ir hamishtalech also will cause tumah to food and drink, because that's the idea. Because the sa'ir hamishtalech is potentially acts like an av hatumah to the person who's carrying, who's bringing it out of Yerushalayim, for example. Therefore, it should cause tum'ah to food and drink. Even though it's not prepared, it doesn't get hechshed, even though it's alive, it shouldn't make any difference, as Rabbanan say. So as Rabbi Meir says, so if Rabbanan agree with this principle, then they should agree with Rabbi Meir. And if the rabbis do not agree with this principle, well then, why would they think that para and parim cause impurity to food and drink? It could be that they only cause impurity as an avatumah to the people involved. That's it. But if it's not talking about the people involved, then it doesn't cause tumah at all in any of these cases. Why should it? When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he explained that according to Rabbanan, these items require that they become tameh from an external source. In other words, the parim hanisrafim, and when they're taken out, then the kohanim will take them out, and the people who are involved in burning them indeed become tameh, and the carcass will act as an av hatumah to those people only. However, the animals by themselves are not tameh. They got kosher shechita and everything is totally valid, and so they will not cause tum'ah to anything else unless they themselves become tameh from something else. Something else touches the parim nisrafim, and then they become tameh. And so if an ava tumah touches the carcass becomes a rishon. That's where that rishon will cause impurity to food and drink. That's what the rabbi said over here, that is true for the para and the parim, because these are dead carcasses. Now, in and of themselves, they are tahor, and the fact that they cause tumah to the people burning them, that's okay. That's a special rule that the Torah says, that the people involved become tameh. But it's not that they become tameh because they're touching it. It's not within the realm. It's not because the para and parim themselves are tameh. However, if the para and parim become tameh from an external source, then yes, they will cause tumah to food and drink. However, the Seri Mishtaleach is a live animal, and a live animal cannot receive Tum'ah at all. It's a live animal. So yes, it still will cause Tum'ah to the person who brings it out to the desert. That's a special Torah law. It's not that it's contagious, that the Seri Mishtaleach is causing the person to become Tameh. The person is by doing the act becomes Tameh. But the Seder Mishtaleach itself is Tahor and cannot become Tameh. Even if it touches a dead body, carrying a dead body, anything like that, a live animal never becomes Tameh from an external source. And that is the reason why the rabbis make a distinction between the live animal and the dead animals. Ba'er Rabbi Elazar, Parim u'Seirim hanisrafin, mahu sheyitameu ochalin u'mashkin bifnim kebachutz, mechusar yisyak mechusar ma'aseh dameh ola. Rabbi Elazar asks regarding these Parim and Seirim that are meant to be burnt, and it causes tumah to the people that are going to use it, as we just saw, as the pasuk says, and in that regard, for those people, it acts as an av hatuma. However, even not for those people, it acts like a rishon to make food and drink tameh. The question is, will it cause food and drink tameh inside the courtyard as well as outside the courtyard? For sure, outside the courtyard. Once it leaves the courtyard, this pod that's going out to be burnt now has the power to cause tum'ah as an ava tum'ah to the people that are carrying it and the people that are burning it. Therefore, outside the courtyard also, it will act as a rishon to make food and drink tameh. That's definitely true outside the courtyard. But how about inside the courtyard? While it's inside the courtyard, it does not yet cause tum'ah as an ava tum'ah to the people that are going to carry it. It's only potential for the future. So will it cause food and drink that it comes into contact with tameh, make it tameh as a rishon, even inside the courtyard? Here's the question. Do we say that mechusar yitziah, since it has not yet left, that's the same as mechusar ma'aseh? An act has not yet been performed that is necessary, like making it susceptible to tumah. That's an act. In order for something for it to receive tumah, it has to become wet. And if it's not wet yet, you don't say, well, later it will be. No, this is an essential act that hasn't been done yet, and therefore that does not make to cause tum'ah while it's inside. Or do we say there's no difference? The idea still is that potentially this could and will make people tameh who are involved in burning it in the future. So therefore, even though right now it's not causing anybody to be tameh, nevertheless, it acts as a rishon for food and drink. That's the question. Batar de ba'ya hadar pashta mechusar yitzia kim chusar ma'aseh dameh. After Rabbi Elazar asked the question, he figured out an answer, and he concluded that the fact that it has not yet left the courtyard is the same as a necessary action that has not yet been done. It's not going to cause tumah at all while it's still inside. And now a follow-up question that Rabbi Abba bar Shemuel asked Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Niblat of tahor l'Rabbi Meir mahu sheyitameh bekezayit. A nevela of a kosher bird, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, as we said, follows the baraita of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, who says that since a nevela of a bird causes tum'ah as an ava tum'ah when it's inside someone's throat, so too it causes food and drink to be a nevela, although in that case only as a rishon. The question is, what's the shi'ur for causing this tum'ah? Now, when it's inside someone's throat, then it can be even just a kezayit, a smaller amount, and it will act as an av hatumah, and even it will cause tumah to the person, and even anything the person touches will also become tameh. That's only a kezayit. However, a piece of nevela, in general, food that makes other food tameh, has to be a kabesa. So in this case, we got it. We understand that since it causes tumah in some cases as an av, therefore it will always act as a rishon. That's Rabbi Meir's principle. But when it acts as a rishon, does it have the same status? Because its power to cause tumah is from the fact that it will be an av when it's in someone's throat, and that's a kezait. So therefore, maybe also when it causes food to become tameh, even a kezait will make it tameh? Or are we going to give it the status of general tum'ah laws that you need a kabesa of food to make other food tameh? Now let's clarify the question. If this piece of kosher bird that is nevela is on the floor, so it's not near anybody's throat, that's easy question. Then it's just going to cause tumah as a kabetza, like other impure food. And if the person has it in his mouth, then also not a question, because he's about to swallow it. It's very close to being swallowed. It's just like, 1 second away. So there it will cause tumah to other food and drink as in a kezait. That's easy. The question is, what if the person is holding this flesh in his hand? Now, do we say that since he has not yet brought it close to his mouth to swallow, that's a fundamental problem because it's missing an action, a necessary action, so he still has to do an action before it goes into his throat, and therefore it's like it's on the ground? Or do we say, no, he's holding it in his hand, and we don't consider this lack of closeness to his mouth to be a lack of necessary action? It's the same as if it's in his mouth, that he's about to swallow it, and therefore it would be cause tumah as a kezait. Batar de ba'aya hadar pashta mechusar kereba lav ki mechusar ma'aseh dameh. After he asked the question, he answered it himself and said that the fact that it's not close by because it's in his hand and not in his mouth, that's not considered a necessary action that has not yet been performed that would prevent it from taking on that status. Rather, it's close enough, and therefore it will cause tum'ah to food and drink, even if it's only a kezait. Itibeh. Now Rabbi Chaya bar Abba challenges Rabbi Abba bar Shmuel's conclusion that all you need is a kezait, and it challenges from a Mishnah in Masechet Teharot that reads, Shelosha asa dvarim ne'amru benivlat of tahor. There are 13 different laws that were said regarding the nevela of a kosher bird. V'zeh echad mehen, here's one of them. Siricha machshava. It requires intention, that the person who swallows it has to swallow it with intention that he wants to eat it in order for it to cause tum'ah. And ve'en siricha hechsher, it does not need to become susceptible to tumah. Remember that this law we found in the baraita of the school of Rabbi Ishmael, and we said that baraita is in accordance with Rabbi Meir's opinion. So that's significant to remember. It's going to come up in a second. It doesn't have to become wet in order to impart tum'ah. Umetama tumat ochalin bekabesa. And here it says that the nevela of tahor imparts tum'ah to food if it's a kabetza. That means it has to be a kabetza, not a kezait. My love, Rabbi Meir he. Now, isn't this Mishnah in accordance with Rabbi Meir? And here it says it has to be a kabetza, so that is a challenge against the Rabbi Abba bar Shmuel's conclusion over here that said even if it's just a kezait, it will cause tum'ah to food and drink. We answer, La Rabbanan he. No, this line that says to metamet ochlim bekabesa, that's the opinion of Rabbanan, and Rabbanan would agree that it causes tum'ah from a kabesa, because it does not. They do not derive that tum'ah from the fact that it could give off tum'ah in the throat. As a kezait, this has nothing to do with it. This is just as regular food. If it's tameh, then it will cause tumah as in a kabesa. Hold on, the beginning of the Mishnah that we just read said that it have to have intention and it does not need to be become susceptible to tumah. Who says that it doesn't have to be susceptible to tumah? That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as we saw in that baraita and from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, whereas according to Rabbanan, it would have to become susceptible to tumah and become tameh in order for it to impart tumah to something else. Now, since the Resha, the first few words of this Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, when it says en tzricha hechsher, then the next words also must be Rabbi Meir, and that would mean that according to Rabbi Meir, in the kabesa, again, a challenge against Rabbi Abba bar Shemuel. And so we answer, Mi di'irya ha-kedita ha-kedita. Wait, are the cases comparable? No, maybe each part of the Mishnah is a different opinion. And in fact, the beginning of the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, and the continuation of the Mishnah is Rabbanan, and so there's no problem. Hold on, the continuation after that in the Mishnah says that if you do shechita or melika on a bird, then it's tahor, even if it turns out to be a terefa. It doesn't matter, as long as you did proper shechita or melika, then found out after it's terefa, it's tahor, there's no tum'ah. Who says that? That would be Rabbi Meir. Now you're going to tell me that the beginning of the Mishnah and the end of the Mishnah are Rabbi Meir, but that middle, or just where it says kabesa, that part is Rabbanan. In Resha v'Sefa Rabbi Meir Mesiata Rabbanan, and says yes, it could be, it's possible that happens, and therefore there is no challenge. That line that says kabesa is Rabbanan, but Rabbi Meir indeed would say that a nevelat of tahor would cause tumah to food and drink, even in a kezait. Amar leRav Hamnuna leRabbi Zera, La tetib akarach ad amart li hamileta. Rav Hamnuna tells Rabbi Zera, do not sit down until you tell me the answer to this question. It's a very pressing question. Niblat of tahor Rabbi Meir, monin la rishon v'sheni, or en monin rishon v'sheni. If you have a piece of it nevela from a kosher bird, according to Rabbi Meir said, okay, everybody agrees, this is a basic law, that if it's in someone's throat, then it causes tumah, as in av hatumah, to the person. The person becomes tameh. However, how about food? Rabbi Meir said that the of tahor, that's a nevela, also imparts impurity to food. Now the question is, at what level? Is it at the level of an av, and therefore it imparts, the food will become a rishon, or if it's and the rishon will become a sheni, or does it only, or does it not make any food a rishon, but rather only a sheni? In other words, that piece of a bird meat from nevela, is it considered like an av and causes a rishon, or is it considered like a rishon and only causes a sheni to food? If it's in someone's throat, then it's an av. But when it's not in someone's throat and it's giving tumah to food, is it like an av or like a rishon? Amar le kol echad tameh adam b'maga. Monin bo rishon v'sheni, kol echad en metameh adam b'maga, and monin bo rishon v'sheni. Rebbe Zera answers, any place that something causes impurity to another human when it's touching it, then it will cause impurity both as a rishon and make it a rishon or a sheni. However, anytime that item does not cause tum'ah to a person by touching, and that would be this case, because the bird meat does not cause tum'ah to a person by touching, but rather only by being in someone's throat, by being swallowed, not by touching. So therefore, this counts in this category, and therefore it does not impart impurity to food as a rishon, but rather only as a sheni. Okay, that was the answer that Rabbi Zera gave. Now Rabbi Zera himself has a question. Rabbi Zera Rabbi Ameh bar Chiyav, Amri la Rabbi Abin bar Kahana. Rabbi Zera asks one of these two rabbis, Haditnan chibure ochalin al yedem mashkin chibur letuma kala ve'en chibur letuma chamura. Mishnah Masechet Teharot that says, let's say you have a half a kezait of a nevela. Nevela will make things tameh. It's an avatuma, and you need a minimum of a kezait. But let's say you don't have a kezait. You have a half a kezait over here and half a kezait over there. But they're connected through liquid. So that liquid will be a connection only to impart a light level of impurity, meaning to foods. So if that connection, that these two pieces that are connected by liquid touch other foods, it'll make it tameh as a food, meaning it has like a low level. But it was not considered a connection for tumah chamura. It's not going to impart impurity to a person, because if it was a nevela, a whole gezait, then it would make a person tameh. But since it's only half and not connected by food, by liquid, so it has only the status of a tameh liquid. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now here's the question. Monin bo rishon v'sheni or en monin bo rishon v'sheni? When this combination of two halves that's connected by liquid causes tumah to another piece of food, is it going to be like an av? Because nevela is an av, and therefore it will make the food even a rishon, and then that will make a sheni. Or no, since it does not make a person tameh, so therefore even the food also will not make the food into a rishon, but rather this combination of the two halves connected by liquid is considered itself a rishon and will only cause food that it touches to be a sheni. Amar le kol hechad im tameh adam monin bo rishon v'sheni en metameh adam en monin bo rishon v'sheni. And so either of these two rabbis to whom he asked the question in the first place answers and says any time an item will cause tumah to a person, then it is, because that's an av, and it will cause tumah to food also, as it will make it a rishon, and in turn that will make something a sheni. However, if it does not cause tumah to a person, in this case, right, we said that it does not cause tumah chamura, which would be imparting tumah to another person. So if it does not, then it does not make something a rishon, and then a sheni, but rather only a sheni. And therefore, that's the case here. Since it does not, this two halves of a kezait that's connected by water will not cause tumah to a person, therefore it's not considered an av at all, but rather only a rishon, even when it does impart impurity to food. Next part of the Mishnah says, Yatsu elu ve'elu. If the Kohanim in the front and the Kohanim in the back, as they're carrying the carcass on a pole of one of the Parim HaNisrafim, once they all of them, leave the temple courtyard, then they all become impure. Mina hanemile, what's the source? Tetanu Rabbanan. Le'alanu omed chutz le'shalosh machanot. Kan le'machane achat lomar lecha, kevan sheyasa chutz le'machane achat metameh begadim. There are two places where the Torah talks about this, and over there, we're going to see which Pesukim is talking about. It says you have to leave all three machanot, all the way outside of Jerusalem, and you have to burn it outside of Jerusalem. We're going to see that from the Pesukim regarding the pod of the Kohen Gadol who sins and so on. We'll see that derasha in just a moment. And here, in our pasuk regarding Yom Kippur, it says Machane Achat. Let's look at that pasuk once again. It says, Parachatat vesira chatat asher ubat amam lechaper b'kodesh yosi el mechus lamachane v'sarefu b'eshet orotam v'et besaram v'et prisham. So here it says you take it out of Machane. It just says one. And the person who burns it, yichabes begadav v'rachas besaro b'mayim v'achad kach yibol lamachaneh. So here it just says one. Over there we're going to prove that it says all three. So now, which one is it? Okay, once he leaves, so this teaches that once he leaves one encampment, meaning as soon as he goes out of the courtyard, then he becomes tameh, even though he needs to go all the way outside three of them in order to burn the animal outside all three. Now, how do we know this halakha itself, that you have to go outside of three encampments? In other words, you just said, here it says three encampments, but actually where does it say that? Pasuk in 4:12. This is regarding when the Kohen Gadol makes an error. It says, "Ve'osiet kol hapad el mechus hamachaneh makom tahor el shefech hadeshen v'sarafoto al esim ba'esh ve'al shefech hadeshen yisaref." He takes it outside la machaneh. Here it only says one, to a place that's tahor, to shefech hadeshin, meaning to the same place that the ashes are brought out. This is going to be important in a second, that when you clean off the ashes on the Mizbeach, every so often you're going to bring it out all the way to that same place. Now, that's one pasuk. So this means, when it says chus machaneh, regarding the pod of the Kohen Mashiach, that's outside of Jerusalem, outside all three. Outside all three machanot in the desert is equivalent to outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Then we ask, Ata omer chus shlosh machanot o eno ela machaneh achat. How do you know it's outside all three? It only says machaneh, so maybe it's outside just one machaneh. Keshehu omer בפד העדה מחוץ למחנה, שאין צריך לומר שהרכב נאמר כאשר שרף את הפד הראשון, ליתן לו מחנה שנייה. We learned it from the continuation in chapter 4, when it's talking about the sin offering for the Eidah. If the Sanhedrin makes a mistake, it says there also that they're going to burn the animal outside. Now, I don't need that meichus lamachaneh because it already says regarding the Kohen Gadol that he does, and it says here that you do it in the same place that you burnt the first one. Let's look at that pasuk, right, just later in the same perek. והוציא את הפר אל מחוץ למחנה ושרף אותו כאשר שרף את הפר הראשון חטאת הקהל הוא. So it says that you can do outside מחנה, and it says in the same place as you did the one before. So this is double language. I don't really need to say both of those things. So therefore, when it says the same place as the first one, then I know it's outside of one. When it says outside of a machane, that means two machanot. So that's how I know it's outside of two. Okay, the equivalent in the times of the Bet HaMikdash would be outside the first is outside the courtyard, and then the second is outside of the Temple Mount. But I still need a third one to teach me outside of Jerusalem. Keshu omer mechus lamachane badeshen, she'en tzarich lomar, she'hareh ne'emar al shefach hadeshen, yisaref, liten lo machane shilishit. So when it says, regarding the removal of the ashes, the pasuk says in 6:4, he shall put off his garments, put on other garments, and carry forth the ashes outside of the camp. That's another mechus lamachaneh. Now I don't need this mechus lamachaneh because I already know that the pod of the Kohen Gadol goes outside of two camps. We already proved that. And that pasuk, as that we read before, says that you're going to burn the ash. You're going to put it on the same place that you put the ashes. So I already know that the ashes would be outside two camps, even without the words machus hamachaneh. Therefore, the words mechus lamachaneh, as it applies to ashes, teaches me that has to be outside three camps, and it's all in the same place: the ashes and the pod of the Kohen Gadol, and now also we know the pod of the Eidah are all outside of three camps. That's how we know it. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, back in the Mishnah, said that the Kohanim that are carrying the carcass of the pod do not become tameh, but rather only the Kohanim that are actually burning it become tameh. So according to Rabbi Shimon, what do we learn from the words michutz lamachaneh? According to the Banan, we learned from it that as soon as they carry it outside the first encampment, outside of the courtyard, already they become tameh. But Rabbi Shimon doesn't think they become tameh when they're carrying it, but only later. So what is he going to do with the words michutz lamachaneh? רבי אליעזר אומר, נאמר כאן חוץ למחנה, ונאמר להלן חוץ למחנה, מה להלן חוץ לשלוש מחנות, אף כאן חוץ לשלוש מחנות. So Rabbi Shimon will use it in the same way that Rabbi Eliezer does in this Baraita, where it says chutz lamachaneh regarding the pod of Yom Kippur. It's one of the padim nisrafim that it's going to be burnt outside. It also says regarding para aduma that is burnt outside of the machaneh. And just like for para aduma, it's outside of all three machanot. It's outside of Jerusalem. It's done on Had Hezetim. So too, the pod of Yom Kippur is going to be burnt outside of all three machanot, outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. Just like Para Aduma is burnt on the east side, that's where Had Hezetim is on the east of Jerusalem, so too the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur will be burnt on the east side, outside of the walls. Okay, so now we know, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's burnt on the east, but how about for the Banan? They don't have this Gezer HaShavah with Para Aduma, so where would you burn it? כדתניא, היכן נשרפין? לצפון ירושלים, חוץ לשלוש מחנות. רבי יוסי הגלילי אומר, הבית הדשן נשרפין. Seems that there are two opinions in the Braita. The first opinion, Tanakama, whoever that is, says, where is it burnt? In the north of Jerusalem, outside all three machanot, like towards Haratzofim. Whereas Rabbi Yosef Galili says, no, it's the place of the ashes, which is actually what the pasuk says. It has to be the same place as the ashes. That pasuk is said regarding the pad for a Kohen Gadol who sins. So that's Rabbi Yosef Galili. Now we ask, Amar Rav Aman Tana de Pelik Aleh de Rabbi Yosef Galili. Who is the Tanakama that disagrees with Rabbi Yosef Galili? He's anonymous in that Braita. It must be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov he de Tanya. Al Shefech HaDeshen Yisaref. Sheyeh Sham Deshen. Sheyakdim L'Sham Deshen. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Sheyeh Mekomo Meshupach. It must be the Tanakama Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because in this Braita, where, quoting that pasuk regarding the pod of Kohen Mashiach, it says, on Shefech Hadeshen, Shefech sounds like where it's poured, where the ashes are poured, to be burnt. That's where you're going to burn the pod. So what does that mean? There's two opinions here. The first opinion says that there should be ashes there already. First, put ashes there from the Mizbech, and then only after that, you burn the pod there. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that it should be a slanted place. In other words, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it sounds like it doesn't have to be the same place as where the ashes are, but rather it could be a different place. And the word shefech just means that it has to be on a slope, and therefore it could be on the north, as long as it's a place on the slope. And so therefore, that's the disagreement. And since Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says it doesn't have to be the place of the ashes, so he could be Tanakama against Rabbi Yosef Galili. However, Amar le Abaye, Dilma bimkomo mishupach pelige. Abaye says they're not necessarily disagreeing about whether it has to be the place of the ashes, because after all, the pasuk regarding the pod elim the pod of Kohen Mashiach who sins says it has to be the same place as the ashes. Rather, the machloket here could be whether the place of the ashes also has to be on a slope. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says yes, it has to be on a slope, and Tanakama of this Baraita says no, it doesn't have to be on a slope. It just means that you poured ashes out from the mizbeach on that spot first, and only then you can burn the pot on it. Tenor Banan, Hasoref metame begadim, velo hamesit et haor metame begadim, velo mesader et hamalacha metame begadim. Vezu hasoref hamesayeh b'shat serefa. Baraita says only the person who burns the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, his clothing becomes tameh, and not the person that makes the fire, and not the person that puts the wood on. Those are just preparatory, and they don't. Their clothing does not become tameh. And that doesn't mean the person who burns it. It means the person who is helping at the time of burning. That you're taking the animal and putting it on the fire and making sure it's burning good, flipping it over, whatever you're doing. That those people, their clothing becomes tameh. Yachol af mi she'na'asu efer metameh begadim. Now, until when? Even after it becomes ashes, and someone still goes and stokes the ashes and moves them around, will they still become tameh? Talmud Omar otam metamein begadim mishena'asin efed and metamein begadim. Pasuk says someone who burns them. Them means only if they are actually an animal carcass, then it becomes tameh. But once it becomes ashes, then it's no longer an animal carcass. It changes into a new thing, ashes, and those people will not become tameh. Rabbi Shimon Omer, otam metamein begadim nitach habasar em metamein begadim. Rabbi Shimon has a different definition, not ashes, but rather they become tameh when they are in their regular state. But once they become nitach, they become incinerated, then they no longer they no longer cause tumah. My benai, what's the difference between saying ashes and incinerated? Amar Rava ika benai de Shavia charucha. Rava says the difference is if it becomes charred. just one charred mass. I mean, it's certainly not edible. There's no flesh in there. It's all dried out. And so at that point, Rabbi Shimon would say, that's it. It's no longer called flesh. And someone who is involved in burning it more will not become tameh. However, according to Tanakama, still not ashes. It's still a mass, and therefore you'll still become tameh until it becomes total ashes. Hadran alach tevul yom.